Week 9 waiver wire presented by Snickers. Rookie mistake. Maybe you just need a Snickers. Getting a look at the top players to add for Week 9. Mike Gesicki is on there. Bo Nix, who is rostered in 64% of leagues, so if he's still out there, go get him. Cedric Tillman, wide receiver, who is rostered in 21% of the leagues that are out there on CBS. Let's send it over to Jamie Eisenberg and Dave Richard. Fellas, I'm already getting notifications on moves that people are making, and I'm panicked because I had a big game last night that my fantasy team depended on. So I got to get to work, y'all.
So do we. It's one of those weeks where it's going to be trying to find some gems off the waiver wire because there's not like a standout player that you're going to say, okay, I got to put this player in my lineup right away. But there may be some situations where you need some of these guys. So start the wide receivers, Dave, because we had another week where he got banged up at the position. We don't know if Brian Thomas is going to play, for example. He's dealing with a chest injury. You got two teams on a bye, so you don't have Deebo Samuel or George Pickens. And the Browns guys are stepping up. Cedric Tillman is easily the prize based on what he's done the last 2 games without Amari Cooper. 1 start with Jameis Winston. Scores 2 touchdowns this past week against the Ravens. Has 8 for 81 last week for the Browns. So he looks like a legitimate potential starter in 3 receiver leagues. Elijah Moore, a little bit lesser a priority. And you see these guys kind of grouped together just based on their teams that they're with. But when it comes to Cedric Tillman, Dave, how much are you willing to spend from a fab perspective, knowing they got the Chargers this week, then a bye, then they get the Saints, which is a favorable matchup, but the schedule gets really brutal with a 3-headed week on the schedule of Pittsburgh, Denver, Pittsburgh, and then Kansas City right after that.
And those Pittsburgh matchups are in weeks 12 and 14 when there's 6 teams on bye in each. So you might think of Cedric Tillman as a savior to replace some of your wide receivers on the bye. But then you think about those matchups, and then you think about the quarterback, and it's Jameis. And yeah, that's been the whole key for Cedric Tillman. He's getting these opportunities, getting huge target volume with Jameis Winston. But Jameis is a roller coaster, and 1 week a receiver can be very, very good. The next week he could be very, very bad. I would lower expectations for Tillman from what we saw in week number 8 and look more at what we saw in week number 7, where he was around 16 PPR points. That's still really good. That's minimum number 3 wide receiver territory. I would say that if I'm desperate for a wide receiver right now, I would spend north of 15% of my fab. I would make him the number 1 priority to pick up off of waivers. But if I didn't have that desperate need for a wide receiver, the fab number would be a lot lower. It'd be around 10%, but he'd still probably be my number 1 waiver wire claim ahead of everybody else on this list.
It's not a bad idea just to pick him up and see if this continues. And the same thing with Elijah Moore. It's not just Jameis starting, it's also Amari Cooper, remember, getting traded. So these guys are getting the chances to play at a little bit more of a higher level. And Jameis, yes, there is the roller coaster, but you go back, you ask Mike Evans and Chris Godwin what that roller coaster was like that one season in Tampa Bay with Bruce Arians.
These guys aren't those guys.
No, they are not, but you're getting 16 PPR points. You say that's wide receiver 3 territory. That would have outscored league neighbors this past week. So 16 PPR points is nothing to overlook. So love that setup for Cedric Tillman. He should be the number 1 player regardless of position added. Let's talk about the quarterbacks here and the players that you're looking at. And this gets a little bit more helpful, I think, for fantasy managers because you can point to some players and say, these guys are must-start options. So Matthew Stafford and Bo Nix are at the top of the list in terms of priority. And then you get to Jameis Winston and Joe Flacco as guys who might be able to step in and help you for this particular upcoming week. If in fact, Flacco does become the starter for the Colts, that's something that Shane Steichen is considering, benching Anthony Richardson. When it comes to Stafford, though, Dave, first game this season where he got through the entire game with Cooper Kupp and Puka Nacua, because remember, Puka did not finish week 1, and he scored 32 fantasy points. What do we expect from Stafford moving forward?
I expect big things, and you started this segment saying that there isn't really a gem off the waiver wire. I would argue that Matthew Stafford could be a gem off the waiver wire. It is now 6 of his last 7 games when he's had both Kupp and Nacua, where he's had at least 22 fantasy points, and he's got that high ceiling to have 3 and 4 touchdown games. We just saw that against the Vikings in literally the first game that he came back with Nacua and Cooper Kupp. Now, those guys have to stay healthy, and that's no sure thing. Matthew Stafford has to stay healthy himself. But for now, I view him as a low-end QB1 rest of season. If I'm struggling at quarterback, maybe I've got C.J. Stroud. I don't mind benching Stroud, adding Matthew Stafford. He would be a priority for me off the waiver wire in that situation, and I would start him this week. I think he's going to have a good game against Seattle.
Brock Purdy is also on a bye, who could be dropped for Stafford, and maybe Caleb Williams, another quarterback who, coming off a disappointing game against Washington, you could drop him for Matthew Stafford as well. And Bo Nix, look, he was fantastic against the Panthers. It was Carolina, but really 3 of his last 4 games, he's been doing a nice job, and he's doing it with his legs. 4 games in a row where he's gotten at least 6 points with his rushing totals alone. 2 games where he ran for a touchdown, 2 games where he ran for over 60 yards. You see the numbers here against Carolina, 35 fantasy points, easily his best game of the season. and you say, oh no, here come the Baltimore Ravens. The Ravens are one of the best matchups you can have. They are number 3 in most fantasy points allowed to opposing quarterbacks. So Bo Nix may be a starter. I would start him over Stroud, like you mentioned. And I said this going into 2 weeks ago. Did I start Drake May over Patrick Mahomes? That played itself out. I would have said start Bo Nix over Patrick Mahomes last week. I'm going to say it again. Start Bo Nix over Patrick Mahomes. The rookie quarterback outplaying the veteran who might be the MVP. Doesn't matter. He's not a great fantasy quarterback. Bo Nix is getting the job done. Looks like a guy you can start this week.
I agree. Baltimore's allowed at least 25 fantasy points to each of the past 4 quarterbacks and 5 of the past 6 quarterbacks that they've faced. Their pass rush is going to be a question mark with Michael Pierce out, and their secondary is all beat up right now. And you mentioned the rushing. I wonder if he might have to do a little bit more of that this week as the Broncos try and theoretically keep up on the scoreboard. That's if the Ravens can put up a ton of points on that Denver defense. Part of this, which has been working out so well for Bo Nix, is that Denver's defense has been great. Their run game has not been that great. And so Bo Nix has had to do a little bit more to kind of carry the offense, and the results have been great.
Let's talk about the running backs. Okay, we're done. No, there's not a lot of great running backs for this week to add because it's just one of those things. Our podcast host, Adam Mazer, just said on one of our shows today that it's good when we don't have a lot of running back stat because that means the starters are healthy. Now, the one guy at the top might be dealing with still an injury situation. That's Isaac Guerendo because we are expecting Christian McCaffrey to return in week 10. Remember, the 49ers are going to buy in week 9, but it's no guarantee. And Jordan Mason, who's been very good for fantasy managers for the majority of the season, dealing with a shoulder injury. He might not play in week 10 when they come off their bye. Guerendo just had 95 yards rushing, had 3 catches on 4 targets against the Cowboys. He would be a must-start running back, whether he's top 20 or top 10. Tough matchup against Tampa Bay in week 10, but you like to have that on your team. So, Dave, are you looking to pick up Isaac Guerendo and stash him knowing that this 49ers run situation is still a little bit in flux?
I can't say that I'm in love with the idea because now I know for sure that I can't use him this week. And then even next week, if McCaffrey's right, you know he's going to play a lot. And if Jordan Mason's okay, then he might even be inactive. I don't even know if he's going to be able to make it. So it's kind of a little bit of a high risk, high reward type of situation. And so in that case, I don't even think he'll be that big of a priority off the waiver wire. What I might prefer to do is see if he doesn't get picked up. And then maybe Saturday, right before week 9 starts, I can drop somebody off my bench who I don't need, pick up Guerendo then, and carry him through the Sunday action, and then we'll find out a little bit more about the 49ers after that. But I don't want to prioritize them at this moment. I might do it on Saturday, don't want to do it on a Tuesday or a Wednesday.
Okay, I would make him a little bit more of a priority. Just if you tell me right now he's a starting running back in week 10 for the 49ers, I'll take the chance that I have to carry him for a week, even if he's not, just because I love to have that situation on my team. We've seen what it's been for Mason. We saw what it's been for Elijah Mitchell. We obviously know what it's been for Christian McCaffrey. And Kyle Shanahan gets great production out of his running backs, and Guerendo coming off of a strong game.
To be fair, it also depends on who you're dropping for him. Now, if it's a total knucklehead, like maybe you picked up Ezekiel Elliott.
Well, the next guy we're going to talk about, Justice Hill's 50% roster, and Guerendo's not close to that. I would much rather carry Isaac Guerendo than Justice Hill.
Unless you need a running back for this week.
I'd find somebody else out.
Even over Justice Hill,
yes.
Going up against Denver?
Yes.
Listen, I know that Denver's run defense is great. That's why I think Justice Hill could get a little bit more involved and maybe even play more snaps than Derrick Henry this week. Obviously, I'm going to start Derrick Henry anyway. It doesn't matter. But maybe you can squeeze out 10, 12 PPR points from Justice Hill. We've seen that a bunch this year. If I'm desperate for a running back this week.
We've seen it 3 times.
If I'm desperate for a running back, Justice Hill is who I'm getting and potentially starting in week 9. I didn't say it would be pretty, but I'd rather do that than get a 0 from Guerendo. It's semantics between the two. If you're good at running back and you're dropping somebody who you don't need, then you can get Guerendo and see what happens. But I think Justice Hill is like a desperation player.
He definitely is a desperation player. There's just no rhyme or reason to when he's going to perform well. Because again, 3 games with 11.5 PPR points or more, 4 games with 7.4 PPR points or less. And even when we see Lamar Jackson, like last week, throwing the ball a lot, he's just not producing 1.2 PPR points last week. That is not something that I think you want to chase. Let's talk about the tight ends that you're looking to add this week. And this comes down to, I think, either need versus long-term appeal. Because need for this week, Mike Gesicki is the #1 tight end to go get because in 2 games of 3 without T. Higgins, he has scored north of 12 PPR points. T. Higgins is no guarantee to play against the Raiders. Hunter Henry has been very consistent in 3 games in a row. 2 of those have been very good with Drake May. Drake May not play in week number 9 because he's dealing with a concussion. Dalton Schultz is in a good spot potentially on Thursday night if Stephon Diggs does not go. Taysom Hill has a chance to help your fantasy team taking on the Carolina Panthers. So there are some situations where some of these tight ends could be very useful for this week, or in the case of Hunter Henry, maybe long term if Jacoby Brissett is starting. But I guess I'll talk about Gesicki, Dave, because I know you don't really love him for this.
Well, I do for this week, just not rest of season.
Not rest of season. Totally agree. Rest of season is not somebody you want to buy into. But this week, you see the numbers that he's coming off against Philadelphia. Did have a fumble in that game, so 7 for 73 would have been 14.3 PPR points. But again, week 2 was very good, 8+ targets for the Bengals. This is the guy that Joe Burrow leans on if T. Higgins isn't there, along with Jamar Chase. In terms of Hunter Henry, though, Dave, you're very excited about the outlook for him.
I think that he could be a low-end starting tight end one rest of season. We've seen it with Drake May where he gets either good target volume or good end zone targets, and either way, I'll take it at tight end if I'm struggling to find somebody who I could reliably start week in and week out. I think he's got a floor of 5 catches per game, 9.5 full PPR points each of his last 3 games as a floor. So I think he could do that. And I wouldn't overlook Will Dissly either. We've seen the Chargers over the last 3 games start to throw a little bit more. The last 2 games, Dissly's had at least 7 targets, at least 5 catches, kind of in that same 9 PPR point range last week for Dissly. I wonder if he could end up keeping it going. I would only go after him if I couldn't get Henry or Gesicki, but he's somebody else that's on my list, somebody to keep an eye out for in full PPR.
Don't overlook Noah Fant if DK Metcalf is out with the knee injury, gets the Rams. They're top 3 in most fantasy points allowed to the position. And Tyler Conklin without Alan Lazard last week scores a touchdown, so another guy that Aaron Rodgers will lean on. That'll do it for us here. Make sure you check out our Fantasy Football Today podcast, wherever podcasts are found. Scan that QR code to get it easier. You can check us out on YouTube as well. We are the best fantasy football podcast, at least by certain accounts. But we will help you dominate your fantasy league. So the Fantasy Football Podcast, wherever podcasts are found.